So actually, I'm going to talk today mainly about my book, Justice and Reconciliation in World Politics, which just came out with Cambridge University Press. And in this book, I lay out some theoretical frameworks for conceptualizing both justice and reconciliation in response to historic and contemporary structural injustice as they relate to colonialism. And hopefully you will be able to think through how these different approaches that I will outline might help to think about the ethnographic museum, its present, past, and future. So one thing that I do in this book is, first of all, you notice the title, it's Justice and Reconciliation. And I'm trying to address a debate in a lot of the literature about transitional justice, which tends to privilege either justice or reconciliation. And often a lot of the philosophical literature doesn't explain how they're analytically distinct or how they're related to each other. Sometimes even some philosophers just say that justice is reconciliation or reconciliation is justice. So I found this very conceptually confusing, and I basically argue in the book that justice is a concept that is about settling accounts for social and political injustice as well as for reforming structural injustice. But we should think about reconciliation as a project about redressing alienation that stems from or produced injustice. So these are sort of two different kinds of tasks, you can say, and can come apart but also can relate to each other. And I think that this kind of framework can help us to think about then, with respect to redressing injustice, what is the goal? Is our goal to rectify an injustice, or is it to redress a kind of alienation that was produced or stems from the injustice? And these two kinds of challenges, I think, are good to keep separate in our mind in a way. The book discusses several different kinds of cases. So another thing I do that is perhaps a bit atypical for a political philosopher is I don't make up too many hypothetical, examples of like people being hit by trolleys or not. Instead, I actually do a lot of empirical research on historical cases. I'm a consumer of historians' work. I'm not myself a historian. I don't do archival research, but I basically have tried to read extensively on various cases because it seems to me that if you're trying to think about a real-world, problem, you have to have normative theorizing that actually connects with the actual empirical history. Of course, you might not like my arguments if you don't like my history, but I always am willing to be corrected if you can come up with a better historical account, as most historians would themselves admit. So these are the kinds of cases, and I should have mentioned actually that the cover of the book is actually a cartoon from 1904 and depicting a clash of arms between German colonial troops and the Herero in Windhoek in German Southwest Africa. And this was sort of a few months before the genocidal edict was declared. It's a long and tragic story, which I can talk much more about later, but I thought it was a good thing to start the book with because, in fact, the book opens with this case of genocide that happened 100 years ago. Okay, so let's get on then to discussions about what I mean by justice. So I primarily distinguish between two broad ways of thinking about the kinds of injustice involved in any major political social catastrophe. One is the interactional form of injustice, where we think about injustice as arising from agents' interactions with each other. This is a very typical way of thinking about injustice in the transitional justice literature. So we think about, who wronged whom, who suffered a wrong. And this leads to, of course, the concepts of accountability and reparation for wrongdoing by agents. So when you think about international criminal tribunals or reparations deals, these all are about wrongful interactions between agents. And of course, we can also say that these interactions can involve individuals. So, war crimes trials can be about individuals and their responsibility for war crimes, but they can also be corporate, right? So states also can incur liabilities for example, starting wars. So much of peace settlements is about which state owes, how many millions of dollars to which other state that they might have wronged. And of course, we can also talk about joint activities between corporate or individual agents. So you can think about sort of purposeful collective intention kind of accounts of agent wrongdoing. Okay, but these are primarily interactional forms of injustice, and I think, again, dominate the transitional justice literature and the practices of justice that we see arising from that literature. So when we think about colonialism, we think, well, what are the atrocities committed? And, there have been legal cases where, for example, the British compensated Kenyans who suffered torture during the Mau Mau uprising. And so in that sense, you have to have something that's legally recognized as a wrong, that then generates, legal redress and then might generate reparations. Of course, we all know that there was something much more wrong about colonialism than just the fact that 5,000 people were tortured, right? So there have been now also other kinds of class action suits that have to do with forcible detention, which involves like hundreds of thousands of people. But that just gives you an idea, though, of the limits of the law in terms of addressing what kinds of wrongs are involved in colonialism. So my book moves on then to say, well, it's not enough to think about redressing the injustice of colonialism through the interactional perspective alone, although I'm not saying it's not important, I'm just saying it's not sufficient. So I also then develop an account of structural injustice. And I'm really basing that on the work of the late American political philosopher Iris Marion Young. Her book you might want to look up called Responsibility for Justice, that was published posthumously in 2011. So according to Young, structural injustices place individuals and groups in social positions or socially produced categories that entail their vulnerability to unjust treatment, structural indignity, or morally objectionable social relations or conditions. And typically, she points out, structural injustices occur as a consequence of many individuals and institutions acting in pursuit of their particular goals and interests within given institutional rules and accepted norms. So one of the main points of a structural injustice perspective is to say that the interactional model usually identifies wrongdoing, assuming a sort of just background condition or baseline. But the problem of structural injustice is when the background condition or baseline is itself defective, right? Then, in fact, all of your measures of interactional justice actually are somewhat wrong. So this explains, for example, why with the abolishment of slavery, slave owners were compensated for the slaves that were emancipated, right? This is a kind of account of interactional justice that was based on a defective baseline, and this is why compensation happened that way and not compensation towards ex-slaves. Also, I want to just point out that there's varieties of structural injustice, so we shouldn't think about structural injustice as just a matter of, say, distributing goods. So just to give you an account of the variety of structural injustices, again, they are not going to uniformly show up in every case of major political social injustice, but it's just, different kinds that you can imagine. They can be things like marginalization from structures and benefits of social cooperation, also exclusion from universes of moral obligation, exploitation of productive labor, also the denial and distortion of political self-determination, as well as appropriative agency, about which I will talk a bit more later in my discussion of reconciliation, and all the way to unjustified regulatory coercion and arbitrary violence. I see many people are taking photos, but if you like, I can just send you this PowerPoint, and then you don't have, it's like my students, like, don't worry, I've put it on my courses. You can download it later. Okay, so the point is that these are just examples, and just to say also that it goes beyond, what we might think of as typically just distributive justice issues. Yes, I was going to also explain that what social structures are. So here again, social structures is a very wide-ranging concept that can refer to institutions, but also to discourses, as well as to formal and informal practices and their material effects. Iris Marion Young talks about like roads and buildings and their effects, and how these can be unjust when they operate to establish patterns of exclusion or domination or subordination or exploitation or marginalization, as well as persistent patterns of advantage and privilege. Okay, so one thing to notice then is that, and I argue this in the book, that colonial injustice ought to be also conceived of as a structural injustice, or as involving several different kinds of structural injustice. And one of them, of course, has to do with colonial legality. So in the book, I argue that colonial legality was a hallmark of the structural nature of colonial injustice. And I also take to task some of the politicians who actually refer to colonial legality not only about, in order to justify not returning objects, because I had not read about that, but in order to justify why they should not pay reparations, for example, for genocide, or for torture, or for any major human rights atrocity. So, for example, the British Foreign Secretary, when the Mau Mau uprising settlement occurred, said, well, we're not accepting liability because it was, not illegal at that time to, torture people, apparently. So, but I argued that by instrumentalizing this historical legality of colonialism and colonial practices to avoid contemporary reparative and redress obligations, by doing this, contemporary agents are actually evading the judgment that colonialism in itself was an objectionable structure of political relation that requires certain forms of political and structural redress, right? So the point there is just to say that it's being normatively evasive and ignores the fact that there are many other kinds of moral and political responsibility beyond legal liability. Okay, so just to give you then, I think, a quick way of thinking about the different ways that these frameworks can structure how we think about colonial injustices, if you use a kind of historic interactional perspective, you're likely to think about the past wrong as leading to a form of a debt, which has to be repaid by contemporary agents, right? So the way you connect past and present injustice is that there was a wrong, it produces a debt, this debt accumulates, and contemporary agents now sort of owe the accumulated debt. Also, interactional forms of injustice, I think, might lead to ideas like the museum collection as a stolen property. We also understand, I guess, based on the very little I know, that this concept is very difficult to operationalize because you cannot often tell the provenance of things. You don't know, like, whether things were done consensually. You also don't know if the consensual nature actually occurred in a background of structural injustice, and therefore the consent is not really legitimating. But if you use this kind of interactional perspective, you need to identify, who did the wrong, who suffered the wrong, and then you might have ideas of return, compensation, or disgorgement, right? So now I think it's important to think about this in the sense that if it is a matter of stolen property, if you can utilize this framework and therefore justify some idea of return or compensation, usually when you return stolen property, you as the perpetrator or you as the person who's giving it back have no claim to how the other person uses that property. So in other words, then the argument that might be operating in this context that some objects represent culture, for example, and the idea that, well, we can't return it because, it's a cultural gift to humanity, right? This idea is going to have a hard time with the stolen property kind of account, because if it's stolen property and you give it back, then whatever people do with it, that's kind of up to them, Like, if you steal my pen and you give it back to me and I throw it out, that's like my right to do, right? So in the end, that's the stolen property sort of logic, right? And then, of course, there's also this other aspect of the problem, which is if you can't figure out who it goes to, what do you do with it, right? So in a lot of cases, you might not know exactly which group you should give it back to. The concept of disgorgement tries to deal with that by saying, well, even if you don't know who the actual people are that you should be giving it back to, you shouldn't at least benefit from it. So in this sense, if you have unjustly gained from something, you should at least disgorge the benefit, right? So this idea doesn't work so much with museum collections, but works with respect to, for example, profits from slavery and so on. So even if you can't figure out exactly who you should give the profits to, you should disgorge it, and this might lead to some kind of collective distributive justice scheme. I think that there are various, and I don't have time, I think, to go into this, but I in the book argue that there are several different problematic ways in which the interactional account tries to establish contemporary agent responsibility for historic injustice. And one of the things I guess I was going to say with respect to Anna is that as moving as the apology was that she read, one of the problems in a lot of societies like Canada, where you have many new immigrants, is that many new immigrants cannot really identify with this narrative. Like, I was not born in Canada. My parents were not the ancestors who dispossessed Indigenous peoples. So I often have this problem where students say, well, like, my ancestors weren't it. They didn't do it. So, like, how do I identify with this? So I argue that, in fact, a lot of these interactional frameworks are problematic, and that's why we need to think about a structural account. Now, the structural account basically says that agents who participate in a social structure and reproduce it have responsibilities to reforming any unjust aspects of those social structures. So the structural justice aspect or argument is different from the historic injustice argument about colonialism. It's saying that the reason why we as contemporary agents have responsibilities is that we are actually reproducing certain patterns of structural injustice in our society today. It's not really that we can be responsible for past injustices. You know, we are not the people who could have affected the outcomes of past injustice, so we can't really be morally responsible for those. Those are done, and the people who did them are responsible. But structural injustices implicated in those historic injustices that persist and are not over are our responsibility. So our responsibility is mainly about halting the reproduction of structural injustice or domination. And that these injustices can be, you know, institutional, normative, discursive, material, epistemic, et cetera, et cetera. So I argue that this strategy leads not to things like return, compensation, and disgorgement, although, you know, these are not excluded, but they lead to other kinds of ideas of how to reform and change social structures. And this requires decolonization, decentering, and disalienation, which are three concepts I develop in the last chapter of the book. How much more time do we have? Do you know? 5 minutes? Okay. All right. Good. Then it's good to move on to the second concept of the book, which is reconciliation. And here, basically, what is reconciliation? So as I said, I think about reconciliation as a response to alienation. And the concept of alienation, of course, has kind of had a bad time in political philosophy of late, partly because it was connected to certain essentialist accounts of the human, which basically we have had to give up. So alienation is not something that has been discussed very much in I think, normative political theory, but until recently. So I am trying to also resuscitate or help to reconstruct the concept of alienation because I think it refers to very important normative problems and challenges in our societies. The concept refers to experiences of disconnection, disruption, or distortion in the structure of human relations to self and world, as well as to the relations agents have to themselves, to their own actions, and to the social and natural worlds. And I rely mainly on the work of the German critical philosopher Rahel Yegi, who defines alienation as a particular form of the loss of freedom that involves a relation of disturbed or inhibited appropriation of world and self. The idea here is that we are all appropriative beings. We all have capacities to make the life we lead, as well as what one does, one's own. We have a capacity to identify with oneself and what one does. In other words, we have the ability to realize ourselves in what we do. So alienation is when we are inhibited in exercising this appropriative agency, basically appropriating the social world in a way that has meaning for us. And alienation has, I argue, existential, interactional, and structural aspects. I didn't talk about autonomy there so much because I think the Marxist account of autonomy and alienation is fairly standard. So the main, I think, new thing about alienation that I say based on Rahel Yegi is that alienation is an inhibited self-realization problem. Okay, so we can think then about the challenge of reconciliation as involving three different aspects. One is, interactional reconciliation, where we think about, what agents have to do to repair their damaged relations, right? Their sort of relation of each other. And that's a very actually standard, popular account of, I think, reconciliation. But I also say that another way we think about alienation is how agents can be alienated from the social structures that mediate their interactions. So often, it isn't so much that I'm alienated from the person who wronged me, but I'm alienated from the social structure that allowed that to happen, right? So that, I think, is another aspect of alienation that is not often addressed in transitional justice literatures. And having studied the case of indigenous peoples, I also want to argue that there's a challenge of existential alienation, which is to say that when this disruption and disconnection with the social world has been to such an extent that agents no longer can realize themselves in the world because their world has become unintelligible in certain conditions of modernity. So existential alienation appears when we consider also Frantz Fanon's discussion of the cultural and psychological damage inflicted by colonial relationships. He says the colonized are the people in whom an inferiority complex has taken root, whose local culture or originality has been committed to the grave, and who must position themselves in relation to the civilizing language, i.e. the metropolitan culture. So I argue that the project of reconciliation should be understood not as the same as the project of justice, right? The demands of reconciliation are different. Also, they may not be the kinds of coercible demands as justice, but it's more of a regulative ideal. It's better to have a society in which people are non-alienated than one in which people are alienated. And this is a society in which all agents may successfully integrate themselves and engage meaningfully in the social worlds that they inhabit. Now, a measure of the conditions for non-alienated flourishing for Indigenous peoples in settler states such as Canada is not so much whether they have retained the substance of traditional values as whether members of Indigenous peoples can effectively participate in shaping the terms of their association without giving up who they are as Indigenous peoples, and whether they're empowered to return Indigenous ways of knowing to the landscape of human ideas. So it's this capacity to integrate and appropriate the social conditions they inhabit that is important for authentic flourishing, rather than a constancy of substantive orientations or identifications. I'm not going to talk very much about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples because it's already been very well laid out for you. Just note that, in fact, one of the articles, I think Article 3 of this declaration, mirrors almost exactly the 1960 Declaration on the rights of decolonized peoples. So in fact, it is part of a decolonization process. But of course, the translation of self-determination for Indigenous peoples is much more complicated and radical than it was for the decolonization of the 1960s. Part of this is because many Indigenous peoples have transboundary relations, and therefore their self-determination may actually require changing sovereign rights to territorial control. I think I'm not going to have time to go through more, so let me just... I also talk about decentering, disalienation. Disalienation is a project of the marginalized and the oppressed to develop their appropriative agency, and here I think museums might be able to help with that. Okay, so to conclude, I just want to say I think one hopefully takeaway from my talk is to say that I think with respect to the work of museums like this one, things to watch out for are not to historicize too much, because always to be aware that in telling history, one is also reproducing a future, right, or producing a future. So the history, the past, the present, and future are intimately connected, and one cannot think about talking about the past, say, of Indigenous peoples without thinking about the present. Also, I think I want to argue a little bit of going beyond a kind of therapeutic healing narrative of reconciliation, which I think depoliticizes the project of reconciliation. I argue for a more political conception of reconciliation that involves structural reconciliation as well as redressing existential alienation, which means, for example, giving state support for the revival of Indigenous language. I also want to argue then that generally one has to think beyond legal liability for wrongdoing or beyond legal processes and more towards moral and political responsibility for overcoming structural injustice and alienation, to which we contribute by reproducing certain kinds of frameworks. I also argue that here we have to go beyond nationalist and statist frameworks of redress. So an interesting point about the German case of Herero is that the Namibian state for a long time refused to support the reparations claim of the Herero, because the Herero are a minority group now in Namibia, and the Namibian state narrative was we all suffered from colonialism, even though obviously the genocidal edicts were specific against the Herero, who became a minority partly because of the genocide, which killed about 75% of their population, as well as the Nama people. And this kind of problem of redress happening in Germany now is one in which the interstate negotiations between Germany and Namibia threaten to reproduce the denial of self-determination of the Herero, who don't have effective representation in these interstate processes. So again, we have to go beyond these and towards what I call structural dignity, as well as non-alienation of the formerly colonized. And lastly, I just looked up on the website the Folkekunde narrative about the museum's mission, and I liked it very much. I think one thing that one can say about this narrative is that it's aspirational. So I guess one of the points of my my argument is that I think this is a good aspiration to have for this museum, but there needs to be some recognition that we are not anywhere close to the kinds of political, social conditions in which this can be realized. And maybe some acknowledgement of that would be very important as a way to think about then the ways that the museum can contribute to fostering non-alienation as well as structural justice. Thank you very much.